Hi, everyone. My name is Jerry Lee. I'm a professor in the Department of English here at UCI, where I hold faculty affiliate positions in a handful of departments, including anthropology, a distinction I have due in no small part to Eleana's, Professor Kim's encouragement and support. One of my current part-time jobs is serving as the director of the International Center for Writing and Translation, which is one of the sponsors of this incredible and meaningful event. I was eager to sponsor this event, not only because some of my scholarship concerns global Korea, but also because translation is something of a trope of authentication within Koreanness. I remember from Professor Kim's first book, Adopted Territory, Transnational Korean Adoptees and the Politics of Belonging, a moment where she gestures to the taxi cab driver in Korea as an authenticator of Koreanness. For many transnational Korean adoptees, a visit to their home country is a challenging experience, to say the least, because of the expectation to speak Korean fluently. Korean national identity is premised on an idealization of ethnic homogeneity. Minjok, after all, doesn't have a translational equivalent in English, as it can be nation, but also race, but also ethnicity. The commitment to Korean ethnic homogeneity has been upheld through various state-sponsored, if not state-endorsed initiatives, including transnational adoption. Central to the myth of ethnic homogeneity is language. Johann Gottfried Herder, whose speeches and writings inspired generations of ethno-nationalist devotees, insisted on the uniqueness of the German language to German blood. An analogous Herderian discourse persists in the Korean context. Those who are ethnically Korean, but not linguistically Korean, are seldom embraced and treated as true Koreans. The closest thing to a multilingual language policy in Korea is, I believe, a revised Romanization system that was introduced in the year 2000 to make Korean more accessible to Westerners, along with a mandate that such Romanizations appear on all public government signage across the country. I'm appreciative of Maja Lee Langvad's visit today because her experience adds a much needed layer of nuance to the realities of transnational Korean adoption. So much work in Korean American studies and even transnational Korean studies is characterized by a geopolitical privileging of the US. I remember once someone referring to the Koreatown in Orange County as the second largest community of Koreans in the world outside of Korea, second only to LA. What about the Koreatown of Beijing, which dwarfs that of Orange County? Similarly, we are reminded that transnational does not necessarily mean US, as many transnational Korean adoptees were placed into homes not just in the US, but in many places around the world. Today's event then asks us to continue to interrogate what it means to be Korean in the world today, even and especially beyond the confines of the US. I'm very much looking forward to today's talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. And do you guys want to sit in a regular seat? Okay, we have a full audience here today, which is really wonderful. So what I'd like to do is just give a few thank yous to the various entities on campus that have helped to make this event possible, today and tomorrow's events possible. They include the Korea Foundation, the Northeast Asia Council of the Association for Asian Studies, UCI's Center for Critical Korean Studies, the UCI Humanities Center, UCI's International Center for Writing and Translation, and Global Languages and Communication, as well as the UCI Global ACES Research Cluster, the last three of which Professor Lee is providing much valuable leadership. So I would also like to extend thanks to the organizers of today's event. I'm really just the MC today, but the true work behind the scenes was organized by Young-eun Gu, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Critical Korean Studies, as well as Elizabeth Kopach, Kao Yu, Shannon Height, and of course, Ji-Hoon Shin, without whom we would not be able to do anything related to the CCKS. So we thank them all for their incredible work to make this event possible. And I'd also like to thank Mette Kim-Larsen, who helped to organize today's reading with Maja Lee Langvad. So there's also another bit that I wanted to speak about before we get into the reading and the other parts of today's event, which is the organizers and myself really strive to make this event an adoptee-centered one. And what that means is that we intentionally centered the lives and experiences and expertise of adoptees who have been historically marginalized in broader cultural discourses about adoption, whether it's in the United States, in Europe, or in South Korea. So I'm just going to read a short code of conduct for today's event, which will also pertain to tomorrow. And it reads this way. This event strives to create an educational, inclusive, and safe space for all participants. Offensive comments that aim to denigrate persons based on their adopted status, birth parent status, race, ethnicity, sex, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, country of origin, age, disability, physical appearance, or religion will not be tolerated. By participating in this event, either in person or online, you're agreeing to this code of conduct. Anyone who violates this code will be warned and may be asked to leave. If at any point you experience or witness a violation of this code, please contact one of the conference organizers. And I'll just add that, it's important in a context like this one, because many of you in the audience may have very little to no knowledge of adoption in your personal lives, or even as a sort of social and cultural topic. And there's been, as we'll learn today, so much work done by adoptees themselves to shift the discourse and to kind of flip some of the scripts that many of us have internalized around what a normal family is, around what adoption entails, around who benefits and who is quote unquote saved by adoption. So all of these discourses, which have been quite dominant over the past several decades, are starting to shift, but largely through the important work that adult adoptees have done. So I'll also mention the fact that I myself am not adopted, but my research interests in adoption have really led me to these sorts of considerations of the importance of giving space and giving voice to adoptees. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is obviously hearing the wonderful work of Maja Lee Langvad, and then that will be followed by a reading by Shannon Mette, who is a graduate student in anthropology, who will be reading the same segment of the text in Korean. And that will be followed by a conversation between Mette Kim-Larsen and Maja Lee Langvad. But before I introduce those speakers, I wanted to provide a little bit of context for understanding transnational adoption more generally. So the reason that we're having this symposium and this event today around what we're calling the states of Korean adoption is because Korean adoption represents the largest and longest running program of adoption in the world, transnational and transracial adoption in the world. So it began in the aftermath of the Korean War in 1953 and continues to the present day. So generally speaking, it's understood that probably 1 million children have been adopted transnationally from all different countries to different homes around the world, but Korea represents 200,000 of those children. So it's almost a quarter of the entire global population of transnationally adopted children is represented by children from South Korea. So you can see that the significance of Korean adoption within the broader history of transnational adoption is hard to ignore. There are many reasons for this that we can't get into today, but one can also just take note of the fact that Korea is a divided country, that the first adoptees who were brought to the United States were of mixed parentage, born to Korean women and fathered by US or UN soldiers, and that a series of military dictatorships led to what was essentially a mass project of international adoption in lieu of setting up social welfare policies and solutions for poor families in South Korea. And that on the Western side of the equation, you had adoptive parents and adoption agencies who really fed the kind of predominant narrative of rescue and colorblind love, that by the time adoptees had come of age and there was a kind of critical mass of adult adoptees, those, that generation of adoptees really started to try to give voice to what was a much more complicated experience. That, if they were largely framed as having been rescued from a life of destitution and largely told that adoption was equivalent to love, irrespective of race or other kinds of differences between themselves and their parents, they started to really ask very different questions about why adoption had happened to begin with and why adoption continues to the present, and also what kinds of power relations were encoded in the very process of placing children of color into white homes. So all of these things, I hope you can grasp by now, are very complex, and they entail a lot of analysis. And this is where adoptee scholars in particular have really contributed to what's now known as the field of critical adoption studies. So tomorrow's event will really be focusing on some of the contributions from scholars of critical adoption studies, but it'll also be prefaced by a keynote that will introduce what's happening right at this very moment, which is a Danish adoptee-led investigation into potential human rights abuses in adoption from Korea since between the 1960s and 1970s. So, the present moment is really one in which we're seeing the fruition of a lot of activism and scholarship by adult adoptees to bring these other histories to light. So I'm not going to say anything more, but I just wanted to try to provide some kind of framework for you guys to understand the broader history of adoption and why Korean adoption is so important to that broader history. So now I'm going to introduce Maja Lee Langvad and also the other participants for today's event. So we're really excited to have Maja here. She's really become such an incredible figure in the worlds of Korean adoption, but also in the world of literature. And this is actually, we're very proud to say, her first US appearance. So we feel like especially lucky to have her here. Maja Lee Langvad is a writer and translator who lives in Copenhagen. She's the author of several books, including Find Holger.Dane. I'm not sure if I pronounced that properly. And the work that she'll be reading from today, which is in English, She is Angry, a testimony of transnational adoption. Her books explore themes such as transnational adoption, national identity, racism, kinship, food, illness, and the act of writing. She has been awarded Danish Fiction Writers Honorary Award and the Danish Arts Foundation 3-year work grant. In collaboration with visual artist Jono J.E. Kim and Associate Professor in Korean Studies Karen Jacobsen, she has translated the autobiography of death by South Korean poet Kim Hye-soon into Danish. And she has collaborated with a long list of artists within video and performance art, theater, film, music, and sound art in Denmark, Sweden, and South Korea. She is currently a writer in residence at University of Southern Denmark in Odense. Mette Kim-Larsen will be in conversation with her after the reading, and she is a graduate student in anthropology at UC Irvine and a disabled Korean adoptee. Her work covers literary translation and editorial work, writings on transnational adoption and race and racism in Denmark, advocacy work on disability, and adoption critique. And Shannon Bae, who will be reading the Korean translation of part of Maya's book, is a PhD candidate in anthropology at UC Irvine. She was adopted to the US from South Korea at the age of 4 with her twin sister, and only learned that she had been adopted without her mother's consent when she was reunited with her mother after 6 years searching in 2013. As a bilingual adoptee, she has assisted in many birth family searches and frequently translates and interprets for Korean adoptees and birth families in reunion. So I'll now turn it over to Maja and Mette to start the reading portion of today's event. Thank you very much. Sorry, I forgot about the order of things. We're actually first going to start off with a presentation by Mette to give us more background on adoption in Denmark.
Hi. So that right context because I grew up in Denmark and I also know Maja. I was part of the groups that formed in the 2010s in Copenhagen. So I'm going to give a thank you. So I'm going to give a very short overview of Korean adoption in Denmark, and I'm going to talk about the adoption between Denmark, and then I'll finish with sort of explaining what the whiteness debate is, which took place roughly around 14-15 in Denmark. So first, Korean adoption in Denmark goes back to 1970 when the first group of 4 children arrived from South Korea, and they were accompanied by someone named Tut Botfeldt. Tut Botfeldt is a very central figure in transnational adoption in Denmark. And she was also the person who facilitated and initiated the adoptions of mixed-race children from Germany, where Denmark became the primary recipient of this group. And I'm not going to go over the history of Korean adoption in Denmark because it more or less follows the global tendencies of South Korean adoption. So I'll only say that there have been adopted 8,658 children from South Korea to Denmark between 70 and 22. And that's out of approximately 25,000 transnational adoptees in total. And you have to also take into consideration that the Danish population is only 6 million people, which is kind of LA. So the biggest groups arrived between the years of 71 and 88. But from 15 to 22, there have only been adopted 3 to 6 children per year. So numbers have drastically declined. Present the adoption critique and the whiteness debate, and the reason for this is because she's angry it taps into these 2 discussions in Denmark, and that was also a big reason for why it gained so much publicity back then. In Denmark and also in Korea in the early 2000s, the critical adoptees consisted of adoptee scholars and activists and artists. They both met up in Copenhagen, but also in Korea because people remigrated, and Maja was part of that group. It wasn't a big group back then, but out of these connections that formed back then, you have something called UFO Lab. This launched in 2004, and I don't recall if you were part of it or not. UFO Lab. Okay, but we all know the same people, right? And you published Spændhugger Danske Fremhugger in 2006 by using your adoption files. And in 2009, Lene Myung graduated with her PhD. And unlike most PhDs who sort of just remain in the library, that PhD has circulated in the critical adoptee community has become very influential, cited, and so forth. And so Lene has really been this central figure in the adoption critique. And after she graduated, she also started to become active in the public debates with writings on adoption and race and racism. So that was what you might call the early years. If we move forward to 2012, 2 major scandals hit the media back then. One was a series of articles in the national newspaper called Politiken about an Ethiopian girl who was adopted from Ethiopia, where this adoption went horribly wrong. And another, the other scandal was, it came from the documentary film called Mercy, Mercy, Adoptionspris, or The Price of Adoption. That documentary also followed another adoption of 2 Ethiopian children. The same thing happened. The adoption went wrong. They had to, in the end, annul the adoption. And what that did was it created this media momentum in the Danish media, because it was more or less on a daily basis featured in the news and newspapers, on Facebook and what else. So it was just a very intense time. And out of this emerged both the think tank adoption, which was led by Ling Young, and also Forum for Adoption Politics, which I was a part of, and that's actually where we knew each other from that time. And we were trying to use that momentum to shift the narrative around adoption, because up until then, the critical adoptees had tried to have op-eds both in national newspapers to intervene, but it seemed at that time like nothing would come true. And so your book, She's Angry, your poetry collection, She's Angry, was published in the middle of August in 2014. Later in 2010s and 2020s, there were some changes happening in this community, both because Lena moved on to Norway where she got tenured, people moved abroad, or people just moved on to different projects, and so new people came in. And so today, the most active group is perhaps the Danish Korean rights group, which will also be the keynote speaker tomorrow. So that was the broad overview. I will say one last thing is when I was looking at the program was a lot of Danes were partaking in this conference, right? And it's actually a good representation of what has been going on in Denmark in terms of the adoption critique, because you both have Maja, who has been part of this all along, then I came in later, and now Peter and Bunyong Han are really taking the lead in the adoption critique. The last thing I want to talk about is the whiteness debate, and it's because I want to, I want to try and explain to you what it was like to try and talk about race at the time in Denmark. After the Second World War in Europe, there was a turn away from using the term race because it was so contested, and instead people preferred to use the word ethnicity, and it was the same in Denmark. And so all the way up to around the 2000s, you literally don't see the word race appear in any writing or any type of way, unless people on the far right wing, if they have some very racist comments that they want to make. And so it wasn't until like around 1999 up until 2005 that you start to see the term race being used in academia. And I also found this quote from 2008, and it's from this special issue of a peer-reviewed journal in gender studies, where the theme is whiteness, and Lena was also the co-editor of this. And in the introduction, it says, in Denmark, the term race is seldom used. On the contrary, ethnicity is far more commonly used in a Danish context, as the concept of race primarily connotes the so-called biological racism. Mind you, that in 2008, right? So there was just a general unwillingness to talk about race in Denmark. And so while we have all these adoption scandals going on, we also have this hostile environment. So what happened was in 2014, before you had She's Angry published, you and your friend Christina Nygaard, you writes this op-ed, which is a response to some reviews of another poetry collection. And an interpretive summary of this op-ed is that it protested against this Kantian idea of what art critique should look like, which means that artists viewed as autonomous, and that the literary critic is an authority who, on the grounds of non-bodily distant engagement with the world, is able to make his, and I emphasize his, judgment on the grounds of a shared aesthetic sensibility. And instead, Lee Langvad and Graffi insisted on anchoring any text in its historical social context of its writer, which to them meant that the bodily categories such as race and gender of both the artist and the art critic orient any reception of any artwork. And this is, of course, a point which is not foreign to you here today, but in 2014 in Denmark, this was provocative, to say the least. And the whiteness debate quickly went from only being discussed among people in the literary circles in Copenhagen to being covered on primetime TV on the news. And it was in this early stage of this whiteness debate in 2014, not long after the controversial op-ed, that She's Angry was published. And unlike most poetry collections, which never reached the broader media, it received coverage in the national newspapers and on television as it tapped into both the whiteness debate and also the adoption scandal, and also just because it's a great poetry collection. So.
Okay, now I'll ask that Maja come up and present her reading of She is Angry.
Should I use the mic or can everyone hear? Yeah. Should I use the mic? Okay. Okay, so.
Yeah, hello. Hi. Yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you to all of you, and thank you to Mette for having this introduction about the adoption critique in Denmark and my work. I'm very pleased to be here today. As Eleana said, it's the first time I present my work in the US, so it's a big honor to be here, and I'm so glad that you're all here to listen. I will start reading the first section of the book in Danish, and then Shannon will read in Korean, and then I'll read the same section in Korean, and then I'll read the same section in English. So hear it in three different languages. Hun er vred over at være en importvare. Hun er vred over at være en eksportvare. Hun er vred over, at adoptionsbureauer i såvel afgiver som modtagerlande tjener penge på transnational adoption. Hun er vred over at læse et essay i Outsiders Within, Writing on Transracial Adoption, at formidlingen af børn afgivet til transnational adoption indbringer Sydkorea mere end $15 millioner om året. Hun er vred over, at adoptionsbureauer proaktivt søger efter børn, der kan afgives til adoption. Selvfølgelig skal man hjælpe børn, der befinder sig i en udsat position, men ligefrem at være på udkig efter børn, der kan afgives til adoption, er at gå for langt, synes hun. Hvis man spørger hende, skulle man i højere grad fokusere på at hjælpe forældre til udsatte børn, så man undgår at separere børn fra deres forældre og oprindelige kultur. Hun er vred over at høre rygter om, at det amerikanske adoptionsbureau HUN International Children's Services er på udkig efter nye markeder, heriblandt Nordkorea, hvorfra de kan rekruttere børn, der kan afgives til adoption. HUN International Children's Services formidler i forvejen adoptioner fra Bulgarien, Kina, Etiopien, Guatemala, Haiti, Indien, Sydkorea, Filippinerne, Rumænien, Thailand, Uganda, Ukraine, USA og Vietnam. Hvis styret i Nordkorea kollapser, vil man også kunne tilføje Nordkorea til listen. Det er vel ikke for meget sagt, at HUN International Children's Services gerne ser, at styret i Nordkorea kollapser, så de kan få adgang til et nyt stort marked. Hun er vred over, at det i dag mere er et spørgsmål om at finde børn til forældre, end om at finde forældre til børn. Det er også derfor, at der er opstået et fænomen som børnehøstere.
Adoptionsbureauerne vil ikke behøve at betale nogen for at overtale udsatte forældre til at afgive deres barn til adoption, hvis det ikke var, fordi efterspørgslen på børn er større end udbuddet. Hun er vred over, at efterspørgslen på børn er større end udbuddet.
여자는 자신이 슬픔이었기에 화가 난다. 여자는 자신이 수출품이었기에 화가 난다. 여자는 어린이를 입양 보내는 국가는 물론 입양기관도 국가 간 입양을 통해 한다는 사실에 화가 난다. 여자는 내부 입양인 국가 간 입양에 관한 보고서를 읽은 후 한국이 국가 간 입양을 통해 연간 1,500만 달러를 벌어들인다는 것을 깨닫고 화가 난다. 여자는 입양기관이 아이들을 해외로 보내는 일을 우선적으로 한다는 사실에 화가 난다. 물론 어려움을 처한 아이들을 도와야 하는 것은 당연하다. 하지만 그들이 입양할 아이들을 먼저 찾아 나선다는 사실은 참을 수가 없다. 어려움을 처한 아이들을 돕기 위해서는 아이들을 태생적 문화와 부모에게서 무정적 분리하기보다 그 부모와 가정을 도울 수 있는 일이 무엇인지 먼저 찾아봐야 한다. 여자는 미국 입양기관은 국제훈련아동복지부에서 한을 비롯해 아이들을 모집할 수 있는 새로운 시장을 찾고 있다는 소문에 화가 난다. 국제훈련아동복지부에는 그간 불가리아, 중국, 에티오피아, 과테말라, 하이티, 인도, 한국, 루마니아, 태국, 우간다, 우크라이나, 미국, 베트남 등지에서 입양할 아이들을 물색했다. 만약 북한 사회가 무너진다면 북한도 여기에 포함될 것이다. 국제훈련아동복지회가 북한 사회의 붕괴를 바라는 것은 그리 놀랄 일이 아니다. 그들은 북한을 거대하고 새로운 시장의 하나로 생각하니까. 여자는 어느 날 아이들을 위해 부모를 찾아주는 일보다 부모들을 위해 아이를 찾아주는 일이 더 우선된다는 사실에 화가 난다. 바로 그 때문에 소위 어린이 수집가라는 말도 생겨나지 않았던가. 입양을 원하는 부모들이 입양을 보내려는 부모들보다 훨씬 많지 않았더라면 입양기관이 어려운 환경에 있는 부모들에게 아이를 달라고 설득하기 위해 큰 돈을 쓸 필요도 없었을 것이다. 여자는 입양 보내기를 원하는 부모보다 입양을 받아들이기를 원하는 부모들이 더 많다는 사실에 화가 난다.
So the book has not been translated into English, but an excerpt has, and it has been translated by Katrine Øgaard Jensen. She's angry about being an import. She's angry about being an export. She's angry that adoption agencies in both sending and receiving countries make money on transnational adoption. She's angry to read in Outsiders Within, writing on transnational adoption, that South Korea brings in more than $15 million annually through the mediation of transnational adoption. She's angry that adoption agencies proactively seek children who can be given up for adoption. They should, of course, help children out of unsafe environments, but to be on the actual lookout for children who could be giving up for adoption is taking it too far, she thinks. In her opinion, there should be a bigger focus on directly helping the parents of vulnerable children to avoid separating those children from their parents and their original culture. She's angry to hear a rumor that the American adoption agency, HUN International Children's Services, is looking for new markets, including North Korea, where they could find children who might be giving up for adoption. HUN International Children's Services already mediates adoptions from Bulgaria, China, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Haiti, India, South Korea, the Philippines, Romania, Thailand, Uganda, Ukraine, the US, and Vietnam. If the regime in North Korea were to collapse, North Korea could also be added to the list. It's probably safe to assume that the agency would like to see the North Korean regime collapse so they could gain access to a great new market. She's angry that adoption these days seems to be more a matter of finding children for parents rather than finding parents for children. That's how the phenomenon of child harvesting emerged. Adoption agencies wouldn't need employees to convince vulnerable parents into giving their child up for adoption if the demand for children didn't exceed the supply. She's angry that the demand for children exceeds the supply.
Thank you so much. That was incredible to hear your work. I'm actually quite moved by what just took place, to hear it in different languages, both in terms of understanding and not understanding at different levels. So I wanted to invite Maja and Mette now to the front to have a conversation, and I'll just let you take it from here. Oh, and I would just add, after the conversation, there'll be time for questions and answers.
Okay. So thank you. First thing I want to ask. First thing I want to ask about this, I think maybe you could tell a little bit about what gave you the idea of finding this from.
Yeah, well, there were several reasons for me why I was writing the book and why it turned out the way it did. But in terms of the structure, the form of the book, actually, I wanted to write a book that consisted of different types of text, like my first book, Find Holger Dane. But then when I started to write this text, where all the passages begin with "she's angry," there was just so much to be angry about, so it just turned out to be a whole book.
But I know that part of it was also you going back to Korea, that you remigrated several times.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Korea from 2007 till 2010, so 3-4 years. And there were two reasons for me moving back to Korea. And one reason was that I wanted to try and build a relationship with my Korean family that I met a few years earlier. And then another reason was that on an earlier trip to Korea, I met some adoptees who lived in Korea and who were critical of adoption. And that was very new to me, that you as an adoptee can be critical of adoption. And I was very both confused, but also very curious about getting to know more about the adoption critique. So that was the other reason why I decided to spend more time in Korea. Initially, I was supposed just to be there for like, I think 3-4 months to do some research, but then like I ended up staying there almost 4 years, being part of the adoption of the community of critical adoptees.
And also all the people you met that kind of materialized itself in the book, because in the beginning you have this long list of people, and it's not like there's a representation one-to-one, but it's still a sign of how you've sort of been a part of this community for many years.
Yeah, in the beginning of the book, there's this gallery of people, of the characters who are in the book. And I think there's about like 25 adoptee characters. There's also a lot of other characters, my Korean family, Korean family, Danish family, friends in Korean, Denmark, and other characters. But yeah, there's this big group of Korean adoptee characters from different countries, because it's a global community. Korea sent children to many different countries here in the US, but also many countries in Europe, Australia, and other places in the world. So so it's a global community, and I mean, the years I spent in Korea, I was very engaged in adoption. At some point, there was nothing else I actually wanted to talk about. I just wanted to talk about adoption, like for those like 2-3 years. I remember even on like Christmas Eve, I would just hang out with other adoptees and we would still talk about adoption the whole evening. So I was kind of obsessed in a way with adoption for some years. And I read a lot of books, articles, some dissertations too, about adoption. And I met a lot of adoptees from all over the world. And all that together led to the book. It was not like that I interviewed adoptees about their experiences and history and stuff like that. It was more like I met people. I was part of this community, and some of the adoptees I met and some of the things they told me and their stories just really hit me in a way. So they became part. It all became part of the book. Yeah, so that's how it worked.
But I will also say, as a Korean adoptee myself, that's I think something that's so meaningful to me, that it is a documentation of our community during that time, and it is something I feel very connected to it. So it's something I've always been very appreciative of in terms of this poetry. I also want to ask, there's this repetition throughout the poem, she's angry. Why did you choose this form? Is it a specific form?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually inspired by the American writer Joe Brainerd. Maybe some of you know him. He wrote a book called I Remember, where all the passages begin with I remember. He wrote, I think, several books. One was called I Remember, and one was called I Remember More. And yeah, I also thought about writing another book called She's More Angry. I still have time. But yeah, so I was inspired by the structure in that book. And then there's a Danish poet, his name is Mette, who wrote a collection of poetry where there's one part of the book, all the passages begin with she doubts. So I was inspired both by that and Joe Brainerd's book. And then, yeah, I kind of put my own material into that form and structure. My first collection of poetry, it consisted of many different types of text that only would, like, you could read on just one page. So I really also had like this need to write a longer text, and I could do that in this form where all the passages begin with she's angry.
And you didn't consider using an I or a he or?
I did consider using an I, but I decided to, in the end, to use she, because for two reasons, both because I needed some kind of distance to the material, because a lot of the material in the book is based on my own experiences, although the she in the book is not identical with my biographical I. There's all these adoptee characters, 25 adoptee characters, right? So it's not just my own story, but it's more like a collective story. So I include other adoptee stories and voices. But I needed that distance but also I decided to use she because I think like Korean adoption to me it's a very gendered practice, and it's mostly unwed mothers, single mothers who feel forced to give up their child for adoption these days. There are adoptees, myself included, who were giving up for adoption because of our gender, because we were born girls. So I also wanted to put an emphasis on the gender aspect of adoption, because I think adoption is very much a feminist issue. So that's also why I decided to write she.
So I also want to talk a little bit about your role as a poet. So in Scandinavia, around the 2010s, there was a whole wave of these obviously political folks which were reshaping this whole idea of what the artist is, and also seeing the artist as a political activist. And many of you made use of the autobiographical genre. This is sort of a way to anchor the text in its empirical context. And we see in your book that you use footnotes as a way to make a reference to actual people. And you have these pictures which we already talked about. You use very vernacular language as well. And how does this relate to how you see your role as a poet?
Yeah, just a comment about the footnotes, or the there's the footnotes, and also me choosing it to be a collective testimony instead of a personal testimony. When I wrote the book, I was quite worried that it would only, the readers would only focus on the personal story, because the first draft, I wrote it as a personal story, and then later on I decided to make it into a collective testimony. And yeah, so in the beginning I was worried that it would, the whole focus would be on just the personal story rather than on the structural critique of adoption, which for me was more important than writing about my personal story. And I was worried that people would say, oh, this is just a book about like one single adoptee who's ungrateful or who's not well integrated in Danish society. We can't really say anything generally more about adoption in more general terms. So that's why I decided to make it into a collective testimony. And then I also I added this appendix. So in the end of the book, there's this list of references and citations. And I did that because, as you also said in your introduction about adoption critique in Denmark, at the time when I started to write the book, the adoption debate in Denmark was very much dominated by adopters and people working in the adoption industry, and it was not very critical at all. So I thought, okay, my book is full of facts, and I don't want people to think that it's just something I invented. So that's why I also thought it would be good to have this appendix in the end, so people could see, oh, it's actually true. You can go to the source, you can read this article in Korean newspaper or Danish newspaper and see that it's not just something I invented. So that's like, yeah, so that's, I had these concerns writing about adoption. I think I wouldn't have those concerns writing about other issues. That's more like, how can I say, if I write about love or death or food or stuff like that, more like so-called universal issues, right, or themes. But because it was about transnational adoption, and the adoption debate in Denmark at that time was not very critical, I had to kind of come up with some strategies, some strategies as a writer to have my point, or to have my point come through to the public.
So that means that these aesthetic choices that you made, they were an immediate response to the environment in Denmark.
Yeah. So it showed in the way I would make some aesthetic decisions.
So how to return to the question, how do you see your role as a poet? And I'm also asking because you have been very active in by writing op-eds, by being interviewed, and by voicing your opinion on adoption, which is not always directly related to your literary work. Do you see yourself as an activist or?
I mean, when I was writing the book, I would see myself as a writer, but also very much as kind of a critical journalist or an activist. It was very important for me to document the conditions in the adoption industry, and to simply tell the truth, or the truth from my perspective, which was different from the dominating view on adoption. So that was very important to me, and I was part of the adoptee community in Korea at that time. So I also wanted to somehow contribute to the community. So the book is also, how can I say, my contribution to the community, and yeah, I think I would never have been able to write the book without being part of this community and people who had been in Korea for a longer time and doing activism for a longer time. I benefited a lot from their work and activism. So, and tried also to include some of it in the book. So I feel in that way, the book is also a result of a collective experience, actually.
But I will also say that at that time, when we were trying to shift the narrative in the public media, we literally had a conversation last night about this, and how all of us who participate in debate species be involved and heavily influenced by that time, and it has shaped who we are today. And I'm thinking that when you have a situation when it's so difficult to voice your opinion by stating facts, by writing op-eds and articles and so on, it seems like it's also the only place where you can express this meaning. It's in poetry, it's in literature. It becomes an outlet where you're able to say everything that you're not able to say elsewhere.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can also say things in a different way, I think, when it's literature. I mean, for example, I think my book can be read both as fiction and non-fiction in a way. So you can read it as non-fiction because it's very informative. You can read it if you want to know more about transnational adoption from Korea. But I think it's also fiction because it's full of emotions and also all these contradictions and ambiguity, and you could not have that if it was like in a I think like academic paper or dissertation or newspaper article. Then you would have to be much more rational, just rational, right? So in that way, it's somewhere in between. In terms of genre, I think it's a hybrid genre where part of it is non-fiction, but it's also fiction. It's a long poetry. It can also be read as a novel because there are some certain characters that you follow throughout the book, and there's a narrative in the book too. So yeah, so I think it's in between genres.
First, there's also this question of who are allowed to portray themselves as a rational subject in the media, and it was definitely not brown people at the time. We have no authority. So moving on, there are many different types of anger in this text. It's supposed to be very aggressive anger. There's the introvert anger where you turn it around and redirect the anger to the lyrical I. So I was wondering if you can explain these different types of anger, and also maybe talk about how it has been received in Denmark versus in Korea now that it's been translated.
Yeah, I think there are different kinds of anger in the book. So I think, I mean, anger is the driving force in the book, and all the passages begin with just angry. And I think anger is it's considered a destructive emotion that you have to control, and if you can't control it, you have a mental problem or something like that, right? But for me, I actually wanted to insist on the anger and allow myself to be angry, and that's also because as an adoptee, you grow up with the expectation of being grateful, that you have to be grateful for being adopted, because if you hadn't been adopted, you would have had a miserable life. You would have ended up in the streets, or something really bad would have happened to you. So there's this, I think a lot of adoptees can relate to that you have to be grateful. And that's very different from anger. So that's also why I decided to focus on the anger, because it was very different, yeah, from this dominant narrative of being grateful. And I think there is in the book this kind of anger that is really grief. Grief of being separated from one birth family, but also an ideological grief or a political grief, because she's also angry. She's angry of losing faith in transnational adoption, that she cannot believe in transnational adoption as a good thing, as a win-win situation. That's a dominating view in the West, and also in Korea, that it's a win-win situation. It's in the best interest of the child, the birth family, the adopted family. It's almost viewed as a humanitarian act, that if you adopt a child, you save that child from poverty or something really bad. So I think, yeah, one kind of anger is actually this grief. In the book, I compare that kind of grief, losing faith in adoption, with a Christian losing faith in Christianity, or losing faith in God, or a Marxist losing faith in Marxism. So it's this very, like, I mean, the ground is shaking, because you're really like losing what you believe in, some very fundamental belief. I think then there's also that kind of anger that you could call indignation, that you are indignant at an injustice being done to yourself or to someone else. And then finally, there is this more idiosyncratic anger, which is also the comic element in the book, because she's also angry, for example, that the airplane was invented. The airplane wasn't invented, Korea could not have sent so many kids abroad.
Do you feel like when you have promoted the poetry collection in Korea, that people have been able to understand where this anger was coming from?
Oh, that's difficult for me to say. One thing I noticed when I was in Korea last summer, when the book came out, was that for many people, many of the Korean readers I met, it was also very like surprising and eye-opening to think of adoption as an industry, for example. It was kind of new perspective to many people in Korea too.
Yeah, because from what I understand, the portrayals of adoption usually don't include this type of anger in Korea.
No, probably not. No.
So we're gonna move on to the reading that you'll be reading. And then after that, we will talk about.
So I'll read a longer excerpt from the book. She's angry with the interpreter for not communicating what her biological family is discussing. She has to pretend to be worried about one of her biological parents being sick in order to get Chung-hee to tell her what they are discussing. She's angry to discover that her biological family is talking about a vacation they're planning, a vacation that cannot include her because her older sisters haven't told their husbands about her. She's angry with her older sisters for not telling their husbands about her. She can't help but take it personally, even though she knows they're not ashamed of her, but of their parents who gave her up for adoption. She's angry with her sisters because they have decided to never tell their husbands about her. She's angry with her biological parents for accepting her sister's decision. She's angry with her biological mother for telling her to put her sister's needs above her own, that she's just one against her sisters and they are four. She's angry with herself for not putting her biological family's needs above her own. She's angry with her biological family for not putting her needs above theirs. She's angry with herself for not making it a demand. Rather than letting her sisters decide whether or not to tell their husbands, she should have demanded that her sisters tell their husbands about her. It would have been in accordance with Korean culture, she thinks, if she had phrased it as a demand. She's angry at Korean culture. She's angry at American culture. She's angry that most of the world has been Americanized. She's angry that South Korea has been Americanized. She has a hard time imagining a country that the US has affected more than South Korea. She's angry at the United States of America. She's angry with her biological father for praising the US. She's aware that he belongs to a different generation, a generation that sees American soldiers who served in the Korean War as heroes. Still, she cringes whenever he applauds the country. It's the same with Korean adoptees in the US, Andrew says, when she tells him that her father says things like USA #1. Those who belong to the older generation of Korean adoptees in the US are grateful to have been adopted, whereas he, part of the younger generation of adoptees, thinks of transnational adoption as American imperialism. She's angry about American imperialism. She's angry about imperialism. She's angry about Eurocentrism. She's angry about colonialism. She's angry about transnational adoption being a modern form of colonialism. She's angry with herself for considering transnational adoption to be a modern form of colonialism. Just because white Westerners adopt children of non-white parents in the vast majority of cases, that doesn't automatically make transnational adoption a modern form of colonialism. She's angry with herself for not considering transnational adoption to be a modern form of colonialism. Like it or not, transnational adoption rests on a colonial past. People's reasons for adopting are rooted in the same beliefs that led Europeans to colonize large parts of the world in the 16th century. Back then, Europeans thought they knew what was best for the indigenous population. Today, Europeans think they know what is best for children born in non-Western countries. She's angry with those who think they know what's best for children born in non-Western countries. She's angry with her adoptive mother for assuming she knew what was best for her. How could she not see her adoptive mother as a colonizer? She no longer feels comfortable following her adoptive mother around in Denmark. Walking next to her adoptive mother only emphasizes the fact that she has been colonized. When they walk together on the street, it's apparent to everyone that she was adopted by her mother. The imbalance of power is unmistakable. She's angry with herself for thinking of her adoptive mother as a colonizer. She's angry with herself for thinking that she's been colonized. She's angry that she's been colonized. It may be true that she grew up with better educational opportunities in Denmark than she would have had in South Korea, but at least she wouldn't have been colonized. This is not to say that she would rather have grown up in South Korea. It is, generally speaking, a waste of time to walk around regretting not having grown up in another country. But being a Korean adoptee does come at a high cost. In his research paper, What is Danish Racism?, Kim-Larsen, a scholar of philosophy and cultural studies, writes, "The psychological and existential effect is that the colonized individual will eventually consider themselves as an other. This experiencing of oneself as an other, where the colonized individual both views themselves and experiences themselves the same way the colonial power perceives the colonized individual, is what Fanon describes as cultural alienation." Kim Rasmussen continues. The colonized person is, according to Fanon, confronted with a choice between identifying completely with the colonial power and rejecting it altogether in an attempt to complete an extensive process best conveyed by the expression to go native. In all honesty, she wonders whether it's even possible for her to, in Fanon's words, go native, whether it's possible for her to become Korean, whatever that means. Maybe it's not meant to be taken that literally, Andrew says, when she tells him about the concept of going native. Maybe just moving to South Korea is enough, he says. She's angry at anyone who thinks she moved to South Korea because she wasn't comfortable enough in Denmark. Her moving to South Korea is about understanding her own history and, by extension, South Korea's history, about having any access at all to a history that is hers. She's angry with herself for assuming that Korean adoptees moved to South Korea because they weren't comfortable enough in their adoptive countries. Korean adoptees remigrate for many reasons, adoption scholar Lene Myung explains to her over a Skype call. And those reasons don't necessarily have anything to do with their sense of belonging in their adoptive countries. She says that some Korean adoptees who grew up in the US and who are fluent in English have better job opportunities in South Korea than in the States. She finds it interesting how remigration breaks with the idea that transnational adoption is a movement from one country to another, from the sending country to the receiving country. When Korean adoptees choose to move to South Korea, it paves the way for transnational adoption to be understood as a migration that isn't necessarily completed when someone arrives at their adoptive country. She's angry that she doesn't feel comfortable in her adoptive country. She's angry that she doesn't feel comfortable in a country of origin. Although, to be fair, in some ways, she does feel more comfortable in South Korea, and in other ways, she feels more comfortable in Denmark. For instance, she feels more at home in the South Korean landscape than in the Danish one. Somehow, the mountains seem better suited to her temperament than the flat Danish countryside. In South Korea, she has a feeling of disappearing into the landscape, something she hadn't felt since that time in Greenland, of disappearing into something greater than herself.
Okay, so thank you. We'll move on to talk about the translation part. And so, could you please start just telling us about the process of translation? Like, how is it decided when you contribute for the group translations?
Yeah, so the Korean translation came out last year in July, and yeah, for me it was really a dream coming true because I started to write the book when I lived in Korea, and I had both Danish and Korean readers in mind, and I knew that the book would be published in Denmark, but I didn't know if it would ever be published in Korea. So that was a very big thing for me that it finally happened, and also in a way a closure to a very long journey. Yeah, it came about because a Korean writer, Kang Young-suk, I met several years ago. We were participating in the same literary festival in Seoul, and she heard me read an excerpt in English from She's Angry, and she really liked it. And she knew then the publisher Nanda and the editor of Nanda, who's also a poet, Kim Min-jung. She's the head of Nanda. So she was really trying to talk Kim Min-jung into publishing the book. And it's funny because actually I met Kim Min-jung many years ago in 2010 when I still lived in Korea. We were both participating in this International Writers Festival held by LTI in Korea. And I remember that among all the Korean writers, her poems really hit me and really stick to me. A handful of her poems have been translated into English, and I just wished I could read more of her poetry, but I couldn't. Only those like few poems that have been translated for the festival. And actually, in the book, I write there's a few sentences about like she's angry that she can't read more of Kim Min-jung's poetry. So it's so funny that many years later she becomes my editor. Yes, she told me that when the book came out in 2014 in Denmark, that back then she would not have been able to publish the book in Korea. It would have been too provocative for people in Korea to read, because it's about transnational adoption, it's about unwed mothers, it's about homosexuality too. So she said the timing was not good back then, but now is the right time. And also, I mean, it's not that I know a lot about Korean literature, but I have noticed that within the last, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years, more queer literature has been published in Korea. There are more queer writers who get their work published. And also, yeah, one thing I noticed that was different from when the book came out in Denmark was that when it came out in Korea, there were journalists writing articles about the book and about me. And in many of the articles, I noticed that they would mention that I'm lesbian, or they would put an emphasis on that. And that never happened in Denmark when it came out, because the homosexuality is not like really a main theme in the book. It's mentioned, I mean, it's part of it, but it's not really a big theme. But in Korea, that they really seem to like to put an emphasis on that. And I think it's because there's a wave of queer literature now in Korea these days. So that was something I noticed. The book, it came out and then a few weeks after it was published, it came out in the second edition. And I know also now it's available in a book club edition with an orange cover. So I think it's been selling pretty okay. And I'm very happy for that. My publisher, they organized this press conference for me, because I went to Korea to take part in the release of the book. So they organized this press conference where like 25 journalists or so would show up. So I felt like a really established writer in Korea. But it's because of, the content that people would be very interested. The media would be very interested in the book. And yeah, my publisher also arranged several book talks in Seoul and outside of Seoul too. There was a funny, we had a kind of a misunderstanding, because I thought I was going to Seoul to take part of the book launch. I thought it would be like this festive celebration where I would invite my friends and colleagues in Seoul and Korea. And then a few weeks before I left, I wrote to my editor, so shouldn't we send out invitations to people, so for the book release event? And then she wrote back, oh, I think there's been a misunderstanding, because here in Korea, book launch, it only means that you call the distribution agency and they send a truck over to pick up the books, and then they distribute it to the newspaper offices. So I was like, oh, but I booked this whole trip, and so that was a big misunderstanding. We had several misunderstandings because of language barrier and cultural barriers. But then they ended up arranging this press conference and book talk. So they did so much in terms of promoting the book. So I was very, very pleased with all that. I just want to mention a few things about the translation process, because it was quite challenging actually. There's no professional translator from Danish to Korean, or the other way around actually. So we had to look for an alternative way to translate the book. So there's this one Korean woman living in Norway, Sun Hwa-soo, and she's a professional translator. She's been translating a lot of books from Norwegian into Korean. And since Danish and Norwegian are quite similar, especially in terms of the written language, she was willing to take on the job of translating the book into Korean. So she did the translation, and then actually my ex, who's a visual artist, her name is Juno Kim. She is fluent in Korean and she reads Danish, and she has a very strong sense of the literary sense, very good literary sense. So she would go through the translation several times together with the editors at Nanda. So it was a difficult process because there's no professional translator.
It sounds like an exhausting process.
It was actually for everyone, I think. Yeah.
But it's a general issue in Denmark. We don't have much literature translated from Korean because I know that you have plans of working your way into the Korean language at some point because you saw a need for it. So I also want to mention, for example, in French, there are many publications that are coming out that have been translated from Korean just because they have the translators available. We simply don't have them available.
No, so I mean the few Korean books that have been translated into Danish have been translated through a third language, usually English, but also sometimes Norwegian. So for example, Han Kang is one of the most well-known Korean writers in Denmark, and all of her books have been translated through English or Norwegian.
This unfortunately is very common in Denmark. That's the way it seems to be because there's a lack of translation.
Yeah.
And what about the grammar? Because I know that was also something that caused the head.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's the grammar. I can also just mention, the title and my name too. So, yeah, the Korean version, it looks like this. There's an outer cover which is black, and actually it says it has the title both in Danish and in Korean. So it both says HUN ER VRED and which I'm very happy for that. It was my editor's decision that it should be in both languages. I think it reflects the content very well, and this being in between cultures, countries, and so on, this double identity. Then there's this inner cover. I don't know, yeah. It looks like this, so it's more similar to actually the Danish original with my handwriting in Danish. And originally, my editor wanted me to write my name in Korean, but I'm not. I mean, I read a little Korean and so, but I'm really not. My Korean is really basic. So I thought, oh, if I'm gonna write my name in Korean, it looks like a child. And I didn't want to. I thought that would be a wrong association to give. Also because as an adoptee, you often get like addressed as an adoptive kid, and I just thought that would not work. So so eventually, yeah, we decided to just use my Danish handwriting. My Korean, we also had some back and forth about my name in Korean, because my Danish name, you pronounce it Langvad, so it's this soft D in the end. And usually I would pronounce it Rangpate in Korean, but my editor suggested that I would be Rankebate in Korean, because I was already known as Rankebate because I participated in this festival, and there I was Rankebate. And she also thought Rankebate sounded more rhythmic, so I just agreed. So now I'm Rankebate in Korean, but I do think like Langvad and Rankebate, it doesn't really sound like the same name. So that was for me also, yeah, it was a bit funny. Then also about the title. So in Danish, it's HUN ER VRED. In English, she would be she's angry, which is quite similar with the pronoun first, and then the verb, and then the adjective, the angry in the end. But in Korean, it's Kuyochanen Hwagananda. And actually, the translator first decided it to be Kunyanen Hwagananda, but then changed it to Kuyochanen Hwagananda, which means that woman who is angry, or that woman is angry. And my editor told me that Kunya was a pronoun that past generation of male writers would use to describe women in their work. But nowadays, because of Me Too, because also there was this killing of a woman in Gangnam in 2016, it became a huge scandal in Korea. It was this misogynist who killed this woman, and several other things that happened in Korea and really changed the literary scene. Also, Me Too was very big in Korea and had big consequences also for some very prominent Korean writers. She simply thought that that we should avoid to use the pronoun 그녀. And instead she wanted to use the gender neutral pronoun 그, but again she thought it sounded too masculine. So then actually we ended up with 그 여자는, which was actually the Korean poet Kim-Larsen's idea that we should use that word instead.
Okay, thank you so much, Maja. That's great. So I think so. We're now moving on to Q&A, and also know that we have people joining us on Zoom.
Yeah, so if there are any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and we can take your questions. I'll probably repeat them for the audience who's on Zoom. So, Maja Lee.
Thank you for your reading and hearing. I'm curious about the creative process with, you said there are many adoptees that you met in Korea and their experiences influence and inform the writing. So were they involved in any of the development of the poetry and the narrative, or did they, how was their contribution incorporated? I'm just curious about how that went.
Can I just repeat for the audience? The question was about the conversations and collaboration with other adoptees in Korea and how that got worked into your creative process.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it was more like me being part of the community and meeting people, and then there were some people and some meetings that really that I really couldn't let go of, and that I really kept going back to, and somehow they became part of the book. But it was not like I interviewed people or they really collaborated in the writing process. But all the scholars that I mentioned in the book, I chose to use their real name. So, for example, Lee Nam-young, the Danish scholar on adoption, Kim Rasmussen, who also still lives in Korea. All the activists and other people that I met and that are part of the book, I changed their name, so I didn't use their real name. But everyone, before the book was published, I let everyone read the part about them to make sure that they were okay with that. So in that part, in that way, they were involved. And I do think now it's so many years ago, but I did make some corrections if people were not satisfied or they thought, oh, it's not really what I meant, or I didn't think of it in this way, so I did make some corrections. And also my family, I mean my Danish mother, not my Korean family, because there's a language and cultural barrier, so I did give them a chance to read the book before it was published, but I gave my adoptive mother read it, and other people too, who I'm close to, and yeah.
Since you mentioned that, can you talk about some of the responses? Were they angry to read about your anger, or were they somewhat also in shock, or were they surprised, or did they feel like they understood you better? And then same thing with your biological family. I assume they've read it as well, and what has their response been?
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, when it came out, when the book came out last summer, I did tell through an interpreter, I did tell my Korean family that now this book was going to be published. And I also told them that they might be sad or angry at me because they didn't know about the book before. I mean, I know they know I'm a writer, but I didn't talk to them in details about what I'm writing. And they didn't have a chance to read it before it was published, right? But I decided to let them know about the book, and then it's up to them if they wanted to read it, right? At the moment, I know my nephew read it, and he was very interested and happy to read it. But I don't think any other of my family members in Korea read it yet, but maybe at some point they will. My Danish mother, she visited me several times in Korea when I was living there, and actually also took part. She met several of my adoptive friends and was very interested in adoption. She actually also went through a process where she became critical of adoption. So that made it, of course, much easier for me to write what I wrote in the book, because it's quite hard, some of the things, right? Like comparing her to a colonizer and all that. But she, luckily for me, she has the ability to kind of also, you know, see it as literature and not to take it too personal.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your reading and sharing your work. Yeah, and sort of there's a couple of moments where you say that you're angry about, you know, the sort of a certain aspect, a structural aspect of adoption, and then you sort of, the following line is saying that you're angry about that. And one of the examples is like saying like you're angry that your adopted mother is a colonizer, and then you're angry that you feel that way about your adopted mother. Could you, and to me, it sort of related back to that ambiguity that you talked about earlier, and so, but I was just wondering about your thoughts on like how you're sort of using those lines throughout the poem together.
Yeah, it's I mean, the anger points in many different directions, right? It points outwards, inwards, and that creates all these paradoxes or ambiguity, which I think is why it is fiction, because you wouldn't have that in a more like in a newspaper article or something like that. And I think it reflects my own process, and I think a lot of adoptees process, you know, going from thinking that adoption, you know, we have been saved and we should be thankful and all that adoption is a great thing and a win-win situation for everyone, to all of a sudden see adoption as an industry and view it as maybe even as a modern form of colonization. It's a very big shift in terms of narrative, adoption narrative, and in that process, there's all this like back and forth. So you know, you think it, but then you're angry, but then you're also angry that you think this way or feel this way, right? So it was also a way to reflect that very confusing journey, also ideological journey. I think it is.
To follow up on that, just a more kind of a comment and to thank you for your work. And I teach a class in anthropology and on kinship and that we finish reading Eleana's book, Adopted Territory. And there's Shannon and Joanne know this also. And the difficulty of trying to get across to students who don't know these things, that the ambiguities that are behind all this and are deep down in people and kind of, tear you up with it. How to convey that. And so this is an anthropology class, but trying to do that. And fiction is not fiction. It's emotional and it's yet factual. What I need to do is read some of the passages to my class. And I think then they're going to get it. So it's a marvelous thing and it gets to the point. So thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually found that really interesting to have had that Q&A or conversation where you actually brought that up, because your work embodies that hybrid identity. Your genre is hybrid in the same way that I think the adoptee notion of identity kind of, has those elements. The reason why I asked that question with regard to like, how did your respective families, your adoptive and your biological, is I should let you and everyone else know I'm also a Korean adoptee, and I did my research in German. I know that's a strange connection, but during that time when I was doing the notion of like coming into subjecthood and subjectivity, and how adoptees have, and particularly transnational adoptees, have a more difficult time navigating, especially when there are so many like intersectionalities that we're talking about, and there is this notion of there's this trauma that's occurred that's not signified, and there's no language and there are no witnesses, and so you come up with this life narrative that doesn't attribute or account for that loss, because quote, there isn't a loss, and that's the traditional life narrative. But as you get farther along, as you kind of lean towards those who claim to try to assist in your coming into subjecthood, that they and help with you creating your own life narrative, that they haven't experienced that loss, and there is a dominant narrative of identity that doesn't account for that either. How do you communicate to predominantly, a global community that doesn't have that experience, right? And so, having hybrid identities in here in the literary forms is brilliant, but it almost is like it almost had to have been, right? And one of the struggles is that here are parents, and what is the primary role of a parent, right? Help the child develop and grow into a speaking subject with agency, right? But when there is that kind of anger and that sense of betrayal and that sense of, this is the thanks I get for, having been your parent, right? Without, again, that kind of identification with your type of subjecthood, right? And that adds another layer of difficulty in terms of producing a work that could communicate what that subjecthood really feels like, right? And so, I was wondering, individually speaking, yes, that's awesome that your parents weren't angry. And when I say your parents, I mean your biological parents. But I know that
I don't know, because I didn't read it yet, right? So I don't know. But I mean, I had to just make my own decision, publishing in Korean.
Yeah.
I was really actually debating for many years about this, and for many years I thought, oh, it's in one way I didn't. Of course, in one way I wanted it to be published in Korean, but in another way I didn't want, because of my family, right? But then at some point I had to make up my mind, and yeah, what will happen will happen. But I wanted it to be available in Korean. It's not just for my parents, right?
Right.
There's a lot of courage.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that is really, I mean, it takes a lot of courage to make yourself, so to speak, out there and vulnerable and visible. in that position where, because there is that kind of like, I don't want to say it's untraversable, but there almost seems to be a gap that can never quite be bridged in terms of that kind of like comprehension of that kind of subject area.
But I do think also actually gave me a kind of a freedom to write in this very honest way and very straightforward, honest way about also my, like, for example, my Korean family. I'm not sure because I wrote the book in Danish, right? And I knew that I didn't know if it would ever be published in Korean.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I would have been able to write the same things I did if I had wrote the book in Korean. I'm not sure. So in that way, it also gave me a freedom that they didn't understand what I was reading or what I was writing.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question.
Yeah. First of all, thank you. These passages were really powerful, and I wrote just one passage down about you kind of maybe going to Korea for the first time as like disappearing into something greater than herself. I think also just as an immigrant, I'm not adopted, but even as an immigrant that got to go back to Korea as an adult, that really hits. That made sense to me, here. And so I was just like wondering, do you feel like, because I know now that it's published in Korean and you kind of are, speaking to the Korean public and saying, this is my stance on these things, do you feel like your relationship with Korea has also changed as a result of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it has changed and will change because now I can also be in Korea with my work. I'm also acknowledged in Korea as a writer, not only as an adoptee. So I think that makes that's a big thing for me, that and makes my connection to Korea stronger, that I can also be there as a writer, and that I can start to have colleagues in Korea because they can actually read my work. So like Kim-Larsen, for example, I kind of formed a relation or a bond with her because she wrote a recommendation of the book that's also in the book, in the end of the book, and I co-translated Autobiography of Death, one of her poetry collections. So there's this kind of like exchange between us. So that's very meaningful to me that I can have that with another Korean poet, not just like Scandinavian writers and poets. So in that way, I think it will change and already change things for me. And of course, also just, because I started to write the book when I was living in Korea, and also it's so much about Korea and also addressing issues in Korea. And so in that way, it just makes, really sense to me that it's available in Korea now.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, please join me in thanking our speakers today, particularly Maja, for sharing her work.